I'm Henry, and this is Yonder's first talk at React Native London Meetup. Continuing with the shameless plugs. If you see in the bottom there, you can sign up to Yonder with a 500-point referral, which you'll learn about points in a second. But yeah, that was put in obviously by a head of marketing, not by me. But yeah, so let's get on with the talk. So hey, I'm Henry. I'm a software engineer at Yonder, and before that, I used to do mainly freelancing contract React Native. Been building cross-platform apps since Exponent and Ionic. It's my second talk, so there's actually a talk online back in 2020 January, just before the pandemic, which is more sort of big company-ish, contains sort of more things about a product that's been, at the time it was 2020, and it had been in production since about 2016. So if you're interested in a talk around that, it's online. But this one's more startup-y. And I am at Henry Moulton for React Native tweets and retweets. So yeah, so I got started with the Ionic. Ionic was it still is, I think it's still around, but at the time it was a sort of Angular 1 wrapper around sort of iOS and Android apps. It was web view based, it wasn't very good, but it was cross-platform. And then at some point, I think I saw this post on Hacker News for Exponent back in around 2016, which said, build native apps in JavaScript that work across iOS and Android. And I gave that a go. And I was at university at the time and sort of started playing with React Native and Expo and have sort of continued since then. So yeah, so in this talk, what's Yonder? We're obviously a new startup, so giving you guys a bit of understanding what we're about, and then moving into sort of, we've been in development for 9 to 12 months, and sort of some developer productivity tools and code generation tools that I've found in sort of the last year have really helped us sort of build the app. And then, a bit morbid, but testing pros and cons as a startup that could die. We're only a year in, and a lot of startups don't make it. Next month, my colleague Vitortis, who is here, will be doing reanimated 2 and gesture handler tips and tricks. So that'll be next month. And yeah, stay tuned on that. What's Yonder? Yonder is a new fintech startup. Although started in 2021, it is not buy now, pay later, cryptocurrency, Web3, or part of the metaverse. It's a product some people in the room might know about. It's a rewards credit card. But to be honest, some people in the room, particularly if you're a little younger or at uni, you might not know about. But if you've seen or heard of American Express, Avios, these types of things, you might have a vague idea as to what it is. But to get into it, you get a point for every £1 you spend on your card. So if you spend £210 online at Airbnb, you got 210 points. And then you can spend those points at, say, a pasta store like Lena Stores, or some really tasty cocktails at Soma in Soho, or if you really fancy it, a really big burger and some other things at Blacklock. The idea here is, we're starting with a sort of rewards credit card that's specific to Londoners, or specific to your city. And the redemption of that sort of experience is really easy. Just pay with your card. Did have it on me. And we cover the cost with a fair use limit. So that's for a timeline. So started in 2021, around the start, Tim, Thiso, and Harry, who came from a company called ClearScore, a credit scoring company, sort of got it going. And then by around June, I joined alongside some other hires, and the development of the card started. October, we had around our sort of first prototype card. And then we launched on the app stores in February. So we're live. We've sort of launched up to I think 500 sort of founder. So you sort of apply for the card, you get that, and because we use React Native, we've launched across iOS and Android. Also, we got to design packaging and how the card would look and plenty of other stuff, but when I joined, Tim, the CEO, sort of had a strategy, and he pointed to this public. It is on the internet. It's from Elon Musk in 2006, the secret Tesla Motors master plan, just between you and me. And at the end of this blog, he's like, so in short, the master plan is build sports car, use that money to build an affordable car, use that money to build an even more affordable car, and then while doing so, also provide zero-emission electric power generation options. Don't tell anyone. So for Yonder, the master plan is build premium credit card, use that money to build an affordable card, use that money to build an even more affordable card, and then while doing above, make money rewarding and credit empowering through products people understand and love. Cool. So getting into the talk. So, as I sort of said, we'd been developing sort of just short of a year. I'd sort of started the React Native code base in around June. The tortoise joined me in around November, December. And one of the sort of principles, having built some apps over the last few years, is, what are the things that lead for a really good developer experience and make you feel productive? And what sort of code could you generate that would otherwise, you'd have to type out time and time again? So when we started, there were no designs. There was no brand. There wasn't actually a name. There was really nothing. I did have, when I joined, a flowchart that looked like this, which was basically how a user would apply for a credit card. And as you can see, there's a few boxes, and each one refers to at least one screen. So I was thinking, okay, I gotta, and I had to build this in I think at the time it was just a few weeks. So I was thinking, okay, how can I build this as quickly as possible? So getting into productivity tools, so just a list there, but diving into every one of those. Screen copy, really nice tool. It was actually showcased at the last meetup. Display and control your Android device. So, when you want to work fast and you're using React Native, it's often quite easy to fall back on the iOS simulator. That feels really nice. It's probably one of the fastest development experiences you can have. But at some point, you realize, I really should be checking my app with a low or mid-range Android phone for performance reasons. And screen copy really lets you just sort of plug in your Android device, and then it will mirror the device onto your own machine, and you can actually interact with it on your own machine, all the touches, all the swipes. And so that sort of lets you develop quite nicely. You're not using the Android emulator, which is often not so great. Yeah, I really like this one. Restyle from Shopify, a type-enforced system for building UI components in React Native with TypeScript. Again, we didn't have a design when we started. So, think of the app when I was developing it as really looking like wireframes, like no color, no typography, nothing. And so, we could encode that nothingness in a sort of theme. And then once we actually added the sort of color theme, actually added the typography, actually added the sort of spacing values and all the other things that might comprise of your design system, we could sort of switch right to that in a sort of minimal amount of code change. And you can actually see as well, Restyle is very TypeScript first. Your sort of values map to, in sort of t-shirt sizes, map to numbers. And you write all of your styles inline, and that gives you sort of autocomplete inside your editor. It's a really nice tool, really recommend it. React Native Storybook. As you saw, lots of different screens, lots of UI. We use Storybook to sort of enumerate through all of our different screens, and we have a sort of script that we can, any developer can go yarn sp on, Storybook on, and then that will automatically switch into the Storybook. Yarn sp off switches back. That's just sort of using a quick node script. We use Bugsnag, really cool tool. Can't speak highly enough of Bugsnag for sort of error reporting, crash reporting. I know there's a few out there, but I really feel like Bugsnag continually outperforms in terms of sort of cohesiveness with thinking around React Native. With Bugsnag, you can sort of attach things like netinfo, app state, the device, breadcrumbs that you sort of show the sort of steps between navigation screens. requests and responses for HTTP. It's a great tool. We have a small sort of secret feature in our app that we've been sort of using for the last sort of since we got started with our founding members. So that if they run into an issue, they can shake their device, and a little thing will pop up saying report error, and then that sends it straight to Bugsnag, so we can sort of like take a look at what happened. And then finally, in terms of productivity tools, sort of quite nice one, particularly if you're using code push or expo updates. The npx visualize bundle will give you a full breakdown of all your dependencies in your bundle. And so you can sort of see the sizes of your dependencies and how they map to the total size of your bundle. Anyone who sort of uses code push, expo updates, you know that the time to download that bundle increases with the size of your bundle. And so this is a great tool to sort of make sure that that download time, you can stay on top of it. Cool, so moving on to code generation. So we've got solutions for screens, bottom sheets. So Mo's in the audience who's created a bottom sheet, React Native, open source repository, really great, we use that. Swagger-driven REST APIs, so given a Swagger, generate a sort of typed API. GraphQL API is quite standard in GraphQL, but we use that as well. And then our icon font. So going through those in a little bit more. So screen generation, super useful. But we use something called plop. Great name. And can sort of like inside our terminal sort of route to the right folder where we want to drop in these screen files. When I say screen files, so a layout file, a screen file, the index, the actual folder, all typed quite nicely, all importing the sort of common components that you'd use in your app. And it will also write a line to the Storybook registry to sort of put that into Storybook. So by the time if you've got Storybook open, you've got a story with a screen ready to gen:(bs, bottom sheet. And then services, we've got something where we can sort of take our sort of Swagger files and turn them into TypeScript-ted APIs. GraphQL, I mentioned that before, and then our icon fonts. So we are using React Native vector icons, which has a sort of, given a TTF, I think, file of a icon font, you can turn that into a full TypeScript mapping. So when I import my icon component, I pass it a name, I get the full TypeScript completion of all of that. And also what's really nice about using an icon font is, over just maybe like importing some SVG, is that it's a lot more performant. So it's using the text sort of native thread versus creating a component that's going to sort of have to do all of the sort of bridge communication to render that onto an SVG natively. So yeah, just to round this off, I've sort of found over the years is, building mobile apps, there's just a ton of stuff that happens in every mobile app you ever write, whether it's analytics or animations, feature flags, offline, permissions, push notifications. And that stuff can really pull you away from your core app features, but you still got to do it. You still got to sort of go through, figure out what the best thing for you is. But I think there's always that sort of tension there where, as a startup, you're thinking, am I building the right sort of platform for today? As I sort of mentioned before, I think Yonder probably has intentions to build multiple products on top of a single sort of app platform. But that's definitely something where you sort of, as a startup, remember, don't forget to build the product. So yeah, so testing pros and cons as a startup that could die. So we're a seed stage startup. Tim, the CEO, went out and raised a seed round, about £5 million. And then because we were credit cards, the funding for the credit on those cards that we sort of, I guess, loan to everyone every month has to come from somewhere. So we sort of matched that with £15 million of sort of debt. We've got that, but then to actually get to Series A, only around 30% of startups make it. It seems that who are sort of on the VC funding track. And so when you think about writing tests, it's no good being an app that has all these beautiful tests and then dies. But at the same time, we are in charge of people's money to some extent. We're not a sort of full banking app, but being a credit card, if things go wrong, it can be pretty messy. So when I sort of came to starting the code base, I sort of thought about a testing philosophy that would work, that would be fairly agile, fairly nimble, but not, when I was at bigger companies before, as sort of exhaustive. So it wouldn't be a tech talk without a meme. So yeah, you've got the traditional testing pyramid, that big load of unit tests that you write with every maybe file, every line of code, integration test, and then end-to-end. But then you've also got this tweet that I think got a lot of traction, a lot of thinking, blog posts spawned from it, JavaScript testing course spawned from it. Write tests, not too many, mostly integration. So what do we actually mean by that concretely? So I think it's in the React docs where it basically says the main job of a user interface is to take some state, often server state, some remote endpoint, and map that to some opinionated user interface. So shouldn't our tests just be doing exactly that? So it might be a little small, I'm not too sure on this big screen, but essentially at the top, we're sort of setting up for returning some JSON from our sort of endpoints. We really are rendering everything. We render the entire sort of app. But this is using React Native testing library. So this is not using Detox or Appium. It's using the React test renderer. And then we do our assertions across analytics, across the whole way that the user interacts with the feature. And there's pros and cons, but I think as a startup, this works for us. So I think it was last year, I saw that Coinbase is an app written in React Native. Their package JSON got leaked on Reddit. And so you can go look at that and see what sort of scripts they use and what sort of dependencies they use. But no surprises. They've got a cryptocurrency app that is not so dodgy. Lots and lots of tests. And lots and lots of end-to-end tests for their onboarding, end-to-end tests for different configurations. And all of that takes time that, as a startup, when the sand's running out, you don't really have. So we're not doing that. Neither are we doing TDD. We're not sort of getting our designs, getting our requirements, and getting going with writing a test, write a failing test, write some code, make it pass, refactor. That just wouldn't, I still don't think, works for early stage startups. What we do is, at the start of a sort of, we work in sort of sprints, but more so really grouped around features. We write out and we pair on all the tests we think we need up front. And then that's quite a good sort of pair programming exercise in that you can take a look at the designs, you take a look at maybe your product spec, and you write out, and maybe one of you catches something, like an edge case here or something there. But that's sort of how we've done it. And then we split up our testing sort of suites across multiple jobs, because it turns out when you're doing sort of render your whole app, there's a lot of sort of stuff that's going on there. It's quite intense for a little GitHub runner. And so non-core sort of refers to authentication, onboarding, that type of stuff. Core refers to the sort of core onboarded user main experience. Platforms, that sort of stuff I showed earlier. So, sort of push notifications, deep linking, that type of stuff. And then all the tests under the sort of source glob are unit tests. But I think, hopefully one day, and we won't go to the grave, we will eventually. I think for us it makes sense to end-to-end test our sort of onboarding, because everyone at Yonder so far has the app sort of day in, day out as their sort of main card. And so they're very familiar with the sort of core experience, but they're not testing on a day-to-day basis. And we do sort of releases via test flight and internal testing before we release to our users. We're not testing onboarding and sign up. So I think we're going to try and end-to-end test that at some point. And then I just wanted to point to a really, really good resource I saw. It's called A Primer on Automated Mobile Testing. It's part of it's a sort of article, online magazine from Stripe called Increment, all about mobile. and actually quotes that Uber, for instances, we only had a handful of UI tests for many years. Similarly, Airbnb, Robinhood, and Shopify have heavily invested in unit and screenshot testing, but have only a small number of UI tests, less than 20. And I think maybe the takeaway there is Detox and maybe other tools have made it really, really easy to write those end-to-end tests. But maybe that's not, maybe it's got easier, but I think there's jury still out on whether that's the right thing to do as a startup. So yeah, I'll leave that thought there. Happy to take any questions, and that is the end. We're hiring. Please get in touch. Ignore our job posts, by the way. They're a little out of date. I'm sorry. But yeah, happy to speak to anyone. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Henry. Brilliant. So first question from me. Got a couple, but sort of before you joined Yonder, you mentioned briefly you started React Native when I think you were in uni, just starting to look at it. What's your sort of career path been? Have you always been in startups, or how did you sort of traject to where you are now?
I did sort of computer science at UCL. I just think, I always have, and I think I'm in a safe space to say this at the React Native meetup. Like, to me, just backend and distributed systems is just not what I want to build. It's you know, I always enjoyed just the sort of just making apps. It seemed great so that anyone around me, my friends, understood that. You know, saying I work on microservices, just, you know, or even to me, the process of working on microservices and Kubernetes is not enjoyable. So I think there was a bit of that. And then I sort of just did a bit of full stack, but sort of went from sort of startup to startup, left university, became a sort of freelancer contract for a bunch of different sort of big and small companies. So OVO Energy I was at for a while, where I did my last talk. That was a much bigger sort of company with a more established sort of React Native app, but also worked on sort of banking apps for a sort of smaller fintech consultancy. Worked at a startup called Thriver, if you've heard of it. It's a blood testing sort of app company. And I worked at Amazon for a little bit before I joined Yonder.
Awesome, awesome. So second question. I feel like what you've described, like Yonder in general, and like having to develop that from the start, I think it's an incredible challenge. But if you were to pick like the hardest thing that you've worked on, or like what's been the most challenging thing for you joining Yonder?
Can I cop out and say upgrading React Native? I think when I think Yonder's like now like a really, I like to think like a really polished app. So our customers really like using it. But I think when I mentioned before, there was a sort of bit where we were at this sort of wireframey stage. There was no sort of designs, and we were sort of going from that. And I think taking that sort of the wireframes and turning them into the really polished, sort of really coherent user experience. It's sort of like the 80-20 rule, if you've ever heard of that, where sort of like, you know, you've got 80% of the effort, and then you think you've got the last 20, but that turns into another 80. And so I think, you know, don't underestimate those small details, but at the same time, those small details are often sort of what makes it feel really great, right? So I'd say probably that, if that makes any sense.
100%, 100%. So final question from me. I feel like I sort of feel like a Rust fan when I say this for Expo instead. So like, it seems to me like you're using just React Native here rather than Expo. Mm-hmm. Have you considered rewriting in Expo?
So I love Expo. I think it's fantastic for the ecosystem. And I'm actually going to, with orders, we're going to App.js Conf next month, which I guess is a sort of Expo conference. But I feel like, you know, they've developed a fantastic standard library. And they've also developed, I think, you know, top sort of application services. So I think, updates, and I think now seem to be great services. I think to their credit, I think what they're still working on is take an app that wants to use the whole React Native ecosystem, but still wants to use Expo. And I think they've got things like build config, and they're clearly working on that. But having ejected before and used uni modules, I know I've had some, a bit of pain in the past, particularly doing sort of upgrades where you're sort of out of the Expo ecosystem, but you're using their modules. And so, can't say enough about Expo, but I think at this stage, it's still, I would probably maybe take another look a bit later this year into what that looks like in terms of the whole sort of build config plugins type architecture, and then maybe go from there.
Cool, awesome. Does anyone else have any questions? And I'll pass the microphone to you.
Yeah.
Are you doing over-the-air updates with code push or Expo updates?
Yeah, so we started when we were developing, we were using code push. Really great when you have no customers. Once you start getting customers, we went to a sort of weekly release cycle, which, so on Friday, we cut and put a release out to staff. And then staff are using that via TestFly and internal testing on Android. And then we try and release that to customers Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And that for us works. Like, I think there's maybe been like one or two instances where we're like, damn, I wish I had code push. But at the moment, I think that's the sort of process we want to use. I think as well, organizationally, when PMs and everyone knows, oh, we could update at any time. I think that gets off your sort of release cycle cadence. So I think there's pros and cons. Yeah. And also I think there is some, you get into this point where say you're using code push. Haven't used Expo updates. I know they've been improving it. I'm definitely keen to take a look in a bit, but say for code push, you've got all those different ways to like push the update to the phone, right? You could be like, hey, I want it to flash and immediately update the phone, or I want to download in the background, or you got all those sort of options, and none of those felt perfect. I think in my mind, I'd really love to have the mental model of, if I push an update, I know my users got that update. That works for the apps, particularly on iOS, where most users have automatic updates. That really works right now. Not all of them, but mostly they do. If I'm using Yonder and I just want to check my balance, and I quickly close the app, has the code push downloaded in time? Do I have to wait for another session? At the same time, I don't want to sort of flash the screen. I don't think that's an app experience that, is particularly good. So yeah, pros and cons, I think, is there.
I'm interested to know how much of a trade-off you think you're making, kind of like mimicking end-to-end tests as integration tests. Do you feel well protected, and is end-to-end testing someplace that you want to end up at some point, or do you think you're just fine with integration?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in the past, when I've done end-to-end tests with Detox, I did not feel safe in the end, is what I sort of, you're in a simulator, you're in an emulator, and that's not real hardware. What we're particularly looking towards is using Appium for browser farm level. You can touch the really old, I was going to say a different word there, Android devices, and you can sort of farm it out in parallel across lots of different devices. It's a lot more security, in my opinion, the sort of simulator emulator environment. And I think also, in addition to that, there's a level of, right now, like, I don't feel particularly safe, quote unquote, knowing that my tests are perfect. But at the same time, that forces me to dog food and forces me to, as an engineer, build dog fooding means everyone internally uses the early builds of your updates. That means I have to build internally a culture where every employee at the company is using early builds of the app to try and catch those bugs before they ship to customers, which I think is better than where I've been before, where no sort of employee use of the app happened, and we had end-to-end tests. Does that make sense?
What sort of analytics library do you use, and what are your core metrics?
So we use Amplitude. I've used Mixpanel. I've used Firebase Analytics. I just trust whoever's looking at the charts to pick it. I don't make a pick. Yeah, sort of, pick what you know, pick what you feel most comfortable with. What's our key sort of metrics? So it's a bit of a digression, but we think about product market fit, sort of have we made something people want in sort of 3 verticals. So access, can we give, when you apply for a credit card, so can we give a credit card to the right type of customer with the right, so that's a sort of key metric we look at. Travel, are people using it comfortably for travel? That's sort of one that's quite important for credit card customers because they want to feel like they're protected when they're abroad. And travel, access, experiences. Do people, I showed at the start, the burgers and the cocktails and the London stuff. Are people going to that? So do people, when they download Yonder in the first 30 days, go to an experience? And then there's some other ones that are a bit more like vanity metrics, like daily active use, which we record across card usage and app usage. And the funnel, sort of, you saw at the start the onboarding, lots of screens, so we have a sort of funnel for all the sort of stages, and it's sort of, not like that, but like that, yeah. Oh.
You mentioned a bit about using GitHub Actions and doing some automation. How much is the process of going from, coding something to it getting to users automated? And how do you balance whatever automation you do with what you were saying before about, not investing too much in things like automated end-to-end tests and things like that because of being a startup?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I've definitely been there when, I'm like coding away at the CI scripts and I'm like, oh, this is awesome. But does that actually translate to making a great product? It's I think something that, like, for GitHub Actions specifically, in terms of actually shipping that to users. So I guess that's the CD and CI/CD. It's not something that we've paid too much attention to. As I mentioned on Friday, I sort of click a button, it heads off to TestFlight and the Play Store, more or less. But do we want to have a more GitOpsy thing? Probably, but I'll get around to it when I can.
So there's probably a weird question to ask given the meetup, but why did you choose React Native, given that you had a lot of experience with Ionic, and that there's Flutter, there's native? What was the reasoning there?
So yeah, just briefly my sort of thoughts on the cross-platform ecosystem. So I think Flutter's pretty good. Just saw their Flutter 3 release, looks really solid. I think a lot about who's the company backing this and what resources do they have. And I think Google is definitely making a good shot at Flutter. They basically have unlimited money. So the question is, do they sunset it? Do they shut it down? But when I look at the actual products Google's making with Flutter internally, I'm not seeing much at all. I think it's maybe one very has made it into production. I could be wrong if anyone knows that. Otherwise, don't want to flame Flutter too much. But I think that speaks volumes. It's Dart, I think Vitordis did a bit of Flutter himself. He said TypeScript felt better, felt like a sort of a faster developer experience. So that's some thoughts on Flutter. I think the most compelling cross-platform competitor right now is, we've had React for a while, and Apple and Google have taken their notes and they've released Swift UI and Jetpack Compose for Android, which are the declarative versions for the ecosystems that came before. And I think I saw a startup pairing that with Kotlin Molly platform. So you write your UIs in the native target, but in this sort of declarative way. And then you write your sort of business logic, data fetching, state management in Kotlin Molly platform. That sounds pretty cool. And I guess you could maybe swap out Kotlin Molly platform for any other thing that comes along the way. And I think that could be quite compelling. Have I missed any other real competitors? Native itself. Yeah, not a real competitor, no. Yeah.
I guess building a credit card app, security is obviously going to come up, and
Yeah.
I guess it's one of the things that probably gets leveled, I guess, at React Native about how secure is it, the way it works with the bridges and things. Just wondering what your experience is, or thoughts or whatever.
Yeah, there was someone at the start asked me, is there anything you can't talk about?
Just about security, React Native, and yeah, only what you're comfortable talking about, of course.
I think it's so far so good. To my knowledge, lots of finance apps are written in React Native, and there haven't been any great hacks so far. I think your vectors are your sort of the JavaScript engine you've chosen, or at the network level, which is more like a normal sort of mobile hack anyway. And so I think we're pretty comfortable with both the choices we made.
How do you measure performance?
What a great question.
And what are the tools that you're using?
So the question was, how do you measure performance and what tools are you using? We've got Firebase performance in the app. Firebase is a nice suite of tools from Google. You can sort of put down traces, sort of start and end times between 2 points. We use that not quite a lot, but we've got some nice initial metrics, just gives you out of the box. So start time, HTTP endpoint performance. It's really quite nice out of the box, really. I really rate it. And then in terms of performance-y stuff, there's a tool called Why Did You Render? WDYR, which is like, you sort of turn it on, it sort of gives you all the re-renders that are happening in your app. And so if you want to say, you've got like a particularly performance sensitive bit of the app, you can sort of turn that on, play with the app in that spot. It will spit out, oh, I re-rendered because of this. And then you go ahead and use callback and use memo your way to satisfaction. And that's been quite good. Used Hermes from default for both iOS and Android. For a credit card, when the main sort of job to be done, to use a gross product term, is checking your balance, our start time just needed to be fast. And so, we've got that sort of like offline first. You don't have to have a network connection. It won't do any HTTP calls to show the first paint. And so then it's really just a question of how fast can you sort of pull your offline data, do some rendering, get to the sort of initial route in React Navigation and show that list.